Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
The formula of politics was very clear. The formula of politics was the combination of 1.5 castes and Muslims. So you got Yadavs, Muslims, and some Dalits and other OBCs, and Lalu was impregnable. So 18 years, Lalu Yadav could rule Bihar without doing anything for Bihar. In fact, even if he was asked why is he not making the roads in Bihar, he would basically say that why do we need roads or why do we need development in Bihar? So Bihar was frozen. And I'm specifically using the example of Bihar because Bihar has such an active political mind. No matter where you stop in Bihar, the poorest person will be happy to come and chat with you, and the poorest person will give you more panditry on politics than anybody in a TV studio can give you in Delhi. But in spite of that, Bihar was a mess. Now, when we went there in 2004 or was it 5, that was the election when Nitish challenged Lalu. Now, everybody said Lalu has this impregnable combination, Lalu is going to win. So that was anticipating Indian politics in a conventional way, that this caste makeup is there. It is so strong that even when Lalu was sent to jail, he just appointed his wife as chief minister. She couldn't even sign her name. Files were sent in a bori to Lalu in the prison. He would clear those files in the prison. Isko ye kar do, isko ye kar do. Then she'll sign those. So people thought that Lalu was going to win. But we went to Bihar and we found, first of all, we found what we were familiar with, which is there was very little in the countryside. So I follow a metaphor which is actually grown in Bihar, but it started in Rajasthan earlier, called writings on the wall. What that means is that when you are traveling as a political journalist, particularly during elections in the countryside, what is changing in any part of the country or what is not changing is usually written on the walls. What does that mean? So initially it started by looking at advertisements. So if you go to a very rich part of the country, say Punjab, then you will find visas for Canada. Canada is spelled in Punjab in those ads as Kanada, right? So visas for Canada. You may find limousine on hire for weddings. That is a really rich state. Punjab is no longer the richest state, but it was the richest state. If you go to another state where green revolution is now booming, say the Andhra Delta between Godavari and Krishna River, right? That is the last cradle of green revolution in India. Then you would find on the walls fertilizers being sold, cement, saria, because people are constructing pakka houses, tractors, agricultural loans, banks. And similarly, if you go to an even richer place, you will find credit cards and things. You go to a poorer place, you will find BDs. You go to an even poorer place, you will find, I don't know how many of you know a snuff or naswar, which you snort in your nose, not cocaine, not anything banned. It's like tobacco that people snort in their nose, but very poor people do so. But then we realized that Bihar in 2004-5 was a state where there were no writings on the wall. Why? Because there were no walls. In most of Bihar, houses were all kacha. Then we said, how does a metaphor of writings on the wall survive in Bihar? Then we found that while there were no walls, some writings had come up. So a wall is just a metaphor. So we found that in some places, when there were electricity poles, you find little signboards on the poles. Or sometimes on trees, you found little signboards hammered there with nails. So what were those signboards selling? They were not selling tractors, they were not selling credit cards, they were not selling visas to Canada, they were not selling anything. They were selling private school English medium education. And then we used that key to go deeper into the villages, and we found that while there was a government school which gave a free meal and children were enrolled in the government school, because also only the government school could hold an exam, just across the road, usually there was a little private school. with a Honda generator. So it had the fan running all day, and where teachers would come to teach. And usually it was the same teachers who were employed in the government school, and they will not go and teach in the government school. And people, then we thought, if these poor people, parents, are finding this little bit of money to educate them in an English medium primary school, while the government is giving them a free primary school, that means these people really want their children to do better than them. And that is where the idea of aspirational India, that India is having an aspirational upsurge. So that is where that idea came in. So if you go and Google the expression aspirational India, it came up in the writings on the wall at that time. Now it's a cliche. It's so cliche that even I no longer use it because everybody's been using it since then. But this came out of that, looking at that phenomenon. So that way you anticipate India. We could not have anticipated that Nitish Kumar will continue to be the Chief Minister of Bihar for 14 years after that, even though he controls no more than 3% of the vote in Bihar. Kurmi vote in Bihar is just about 2%. A few more will vote for him. But he's a unique personality. He's a brand. Without him, nobody can form a government. So he's been partners with Lalu. He's been partners with Congress. He's been partners with Vajpayee. He's been partners with Modi. किसी का उसके बिना काम नहीं चलता है. So if you ask me in 2005 that do you think Nitish will be Chief Minister for 15 years? And I said yes or no, then I was bullshitting you, even if I turned out right. But if you ask me that do you think that this state is changing and breaking out of its old equations of caste politics and caste plus religion, basically identity politics, I would have said, yes, I'm seeing that indication. So if you remember, that first election was inconclusive. Nobody won that election. So President Rule came in 6 months later, there was a new election. That election, Nitish Kumar won. In that election, what was the one line in his campaign that I picked up, which I thought confirmed the idea that India was changing because politicians are very smart. He said, अभी तक लालू जी कहते थे अपनी लाठी को तेल पिलाओ, आपको इक्वालिटी बराबरी का समय आ गया है, सोशल जस्टिस का समय आ गया है, बिकॉज लालू स्लोगन वो सोशल जस्टिस. लेकिन हम कहते हैं कि अब लाठी को तेल पिलाने से सोशल जस्टिस नहीं मिलेगी, अपने कलम में, अपने पेन में आप स्याही डालिए, fill your pen with the ink. That is what will get you social justice. So once again, it was, and people laughed. In fact, many political pundits amongst us also laughed कि पागल है, बिहार में you say कलम में इंक स्याही डाल लो, कौन सुनेगा? But the fact is he won that election with a majority. So that way you can anticipate what is changing in India. And if you look at my subsequent travels in Bihar, next time we noticed that in Bihar, on the Bihar streets, on Bihar, suddenly Bihar had these blacktop roads everywhere, even going into villages. You found all these young women riding bicycles because Nitish in his first term had promised that any girl going from class 8 to 10 will be given a free bicycle. So this look at young women in school uniforms riding bicycles told you that a change is taking place. By the time he came up for his third election, we found that one, there were walls in Bihar, and we discovered something else very interesting on the walls in Bihar. And that is when, in fact, shortly after Barack Obama had visited India in Manmohan Singh's times. And what we saw was these hoardings all over the walls in Bihar selling what were branded underwear, right? Rupa underwear, something else underwear, something else, and all the usual underwear advertising, under fit, bahar hit, right? There was even a brand called John Obama underwear. And once again, we thought that here is a place which 5-6 years back had nothing to sell on the walls, which had no walls. By the next election, it had the walls. By third election, they are selling branded underwear, which means in a state where people had nothing, no surplus cash in their pockets after their 3 square meals, now they have some money in the pocket so they can buy branded underwear. So that is how you as a political journalist, you observe things and then you figure out that there is change. So if you anticipate change, you can anticipate broader political development. But you cannot, I mean, if you ask me to tell you what will happen in 2024. Now, I will tell you, if I was an economist, or these days, people who are even more inaccurate than economists are epidemiologists, because they work on the basis of what is called a ceteris paribus. Ceteris paribus is a Greek or Latin, whatever it is. It's Latin and Greek for me. But economists love to use it. Ceteris paribus means all things remaining the same. So they say, somebody said all things remaining the same. Somebody said in March, this was a guy called Ramanan Lakshmi Narayanan, who I made a great deal of fun of. And I hope I'm not proven wrong, because that will be cruel to everybody. He said that in 3 months, 4 million Indians will be dead. And 50 crore Indians in 3 months will be infected. And how did he calculate that? He said, because when it didn't happen, he's saying, oh, that is because I had presumed that if nobody intervenes with this, if there is no lockdown, people don't use masks, that is called ceteris paribus. So dimag aapka kharab hai, hamara kyun kharab karte hai? So politics is not like that. You cannot anticipate politics like that, because societies change, people change. People are not ceteris paribus. Societies are not ceteris paribus. All this keeps changing. So that is why, as a political journalist, your work is so much fun. And we saw this then coming up everywhere. I've used the same metaphor, say, covering Pakistan also. Pakistan elections, the last election that I went to cover, when Nawaz Sharif got elected. Not last one, after that I didn't go to Pakistan, because I just find that Pakistan's become much too unsafe, particularly for people like me, who are easily recognized. And I am good ransom value in Pakistan. So I don't travel to Pakistan anymore, not to cover elections at least. I don't think I can afford to be footloose in Pakistan. So I didn't go for the last election, but one before that, and I was searching for my writings on the wall. And I don't read Urdu. I don't read even ABC or what is called Alif, Be, Pe of Urdu. But so how do I read writings on the wall when I don't read Urdu? And I found that there was a lot of stuff on the walls, but there was a picture. The most common picture you saw on the walls is something that looked like our inverter, electricity inverter. And it said UPS. Those three letters were written in English. So I asked a friend of mine, UPS है, साथ में क्या लगा हुआ है, inverter type क्या चीज होती है? तो बोला यार power cut बहुत होता है पाकिस्तान में, 18 घंटे power जाती है. It's a big issue. So the hottest selling thing on the walls of Pakistan was electrical inverter. And then we figured that the main message that Nawaz Sharif was giving in that election was that if I come in 6 months, you will have sufficient power, load shedding, and power cuts will go away. So once again, the walls told us what to anticipate in Pakistan. And he came to power with 2/3 majority. When he came to power with 2/3 majority, among the first things he said was that this is my government, army can't come and interfere with my government. The second thing he did within his first month was to file a case of treason against General Pervez Musharraf. Right? Because he said, it's now I've got 2/3 majority, this is a Jamhuri Sarkar, I've done it. So in fact, I met him then. I'd gone for Lahore Literary Festival and he called me home for tea. And I said, आप गलती कर रहे हैं, आपको जनरल निकाल देंगे. So he said, मेरी 2/3 अक्सरियत है, कैसे निकाल सकते हैं? So I told him, because आपकी country की reality ये है. Because you may get 90% majority right now, you have 2/3, you may have 90%, but the power remains with those guys. But he said, but Musharraf was a traitor. He said, but still he was the chief of army staff. Pakistan army will never accept this, that one of their former chiefs is tried and convicted for treason, because this will destroy their institutional power. Now he did not listen. See what happened. He landed up in jail. He was dismissed while in the tenure of the same government. Despite his majority, he was sent to jail. He's now in exile in London. So those things, again, you could anticipate. I mean, you could see that Pakistanis, the biggest problem on their mind in that election was power cuts. right? If you don't have power for 18 months, you live in Kolkata. Kolkata used to be like that. When we were in college, we remember there used to be a magazine called Illustrated Weekly of India, run by Kushwant Singh, which once had a feature on how do people live with power cuts in Kolkata. And that even had pictures of banks, government banks, all banks were government banks those days, working in Kolkata with power cuts, with all the clerks working in their singlets, in their banyans, sleeveless banyans, with their shirts off because it was so hot. So it's very tough to do without power 18 hours a day. So you could see that this was a hot button item. Similarly, when you know that this fellow is going arrogant with his 2/3 majority, is running straight into his army, then you know that he is going to hit an immovable object in self-destruct. So that is how you anticipate politics, you anticipate a country by tracking change. And we've seen this change come up all the time. In America, they say, what is the American dream? The American dream is that every parent thinks that my children should do better than me. That is the American dream. In India, we didn't have it until 25 years ago. Economic reform gave it to us. So India got into a situation where people became very aspirational. So 2009, 10, 11, if you again see my writings from UP, Bihar, Andhra, traveling in UP in 2012, I noticed something else. I noticed, say, in Allahabad and places, first of all, I noted elsewhere, and we had recorded it, that the big deal now in the Hindi heartland in terms of change is coaching schools. That is for IITs, IAS, medical examinations, I'm sure now for law schools, because everybody wants their children to compete, and people pay from their savings. They even sell their buffaloes, their tractors, their land to send their children to coaching schools. But next time, as it went on, I found another phenomenon rise. And I first noticed in Allahabad, it said Verma Sir ki physics ki class, or it said Sharma Sir ki chemistry ki class. So it tells you that these tutors also are becoming superstars now. Flana retired IAS ki prepares you for IAS interviews. So you've seen that this big change in India. And sometimes I can tell you that filmmakers are smarter than us journalists also. Journalists think we are the cat's whiskers, we are the smartest of all. That's not true. Good filmmakers are much smarter than us because they pick up change even before us. So see, in 2001, a film called Dil Chahta Hai came. How many of you have seen Dil Chahta Hai?
Yes, we've seen.
फरहान अख्तर ने बनाई थी. It had आमिर खान, सैफ अली खान और एक उसमें कौन और था, मैं भूल रहा हूँ उसका नाम. पर वो दिल चाहता है क्या था? तो after I saw the film, I wrote a column, my regular national interest, and I said this film tells you 10 years after economic reform, India has a fundamental shift, because that film was also such a big hit, because that film was a breathless and unabashed celebration of being rich, right? Everybody drank champagne, they all rode great cars, they had a great lifestyle, they spent money, they went on expensive holidays, all six of them. That was all three men. I think Akshay Khanna was there, that he was a third. All six of them. Normally in a Hindi film, one of them would have been the son of a widow who would have been working as a, what you call in Bombay, Kamwali Bai, or a maid servant in the house of one of the other two. And the other two would come to his home and say, आंटी जो आपके हाथ के खाने का मजा है वो किसी और हमारे घर के खाने के मजे में है ही नहीं, खाने में है ही नहीं. But there was no such qualification there. It was just a breathless celebration of being rich. And in a country where traditionally we have glorified being rich, so much so that see, our ancestors have played great fraud on us because they could not find a way for us to get prosperous. They glorified poverty. That's why they said God resides in the body of the poor. And that's why this whole idea of Daridra Narayan came in, that गरीब के अंदर भगवान रहता है, भगवान तो गरीब नहीं है. But so these are things that you can see as change. And I did have some fun with that article. I said, look, we are a country that celebrates Narayan Murthy not because he's made so much money. We celebrate Narayan Murthy because he still travels economy class and cleans his own toilet. Why does he have to travel economy class? What's he proving to us? So Narayan Murthy and I still exchange banter on it. Narayan Murthy came to release that same book which had that article in Bangalore and mentioned that story. And he's one of our investors, in fact, now. So it's not as if your friendships change because you take a crack at somebody, but I'm saying that these things tell you how things are changing. And once again, you could see, and I can take you back to change. Until 1989, Indian politics was all Congress dominated. Now, how was somebody going to break that Congress stranglehold? So a bunch of things happened in Rajiv Gandhi's 5 years. First of all, he amended the constitution to overturn the Shah Bano case judgment. Shah Bano case, I don't know how many of you are familiar. Shah Bano case was that this old woman called Shah Bano, she had been divorced by her husband, usual triple talaq. She went to the court asking for alimony. The husband said, no alimony, this was a nikah, this is your nikah nama, this is what you were owed. You're all law students, you should understand, that. In fact, you must know about Shah Bano case.
Yes.
What am I doing that? For a moment, I got confused thinking you are IITs. You're IIT people. You are smart law people. You are not dumb IIT wallahs. So you know the story. So Rajiv Gandhi, instead of honoring the Supreme Court's judgment, changed the constitution to nullify Supreme Court's judgment. That got the Hindus very angry, even moderate Hindus, because they thought this was appeasement. Because Rajiv Gandhi had actually leaned on the side of fundamentalists, Maulvis. And that is when one of the brightest ministers, young ministers in Rahul Gandhi's cabinet, who's a Muslim, he left in disillusionment. He is now the governor of Kerala, that is Arif Muhammad Khan. Arif Muhammad Khan was a minister in Rajiv Gandhi's cabinet, and he protested, and he is a devout Muslim. He was the president of Aligarh Muslim University Students' Union. So he left. Then in response to that, because Rajiv got panicky, he allowed the unlocking of the Babri Masjid, Ram Janmabhoomi site. Otherwise, it had been under lock and key since 1948. He allowed it to be unlocked. Unlocking ke baad mein, he allowed the Shilanyas because he was afraid that Hindus had got angry with him. After the Shilanyas, he also went and started his campaign for 1989 elections from Ayodhya and said that we will now bring Ram Rajya in India. In the process, what happened was that Hindus had already got upset with him because of Shah Bano case and because of his ban on Salman Rushdie's book. India became the first country to ban Salman Rushdie's book. At the same time, Muslims were now mad with him because he had allowed the unlocking of the temple mosque complex and he had allowed the Shilanyas, etc., etc. So na Khudahi mila na Visale salam. He was losing out on both sides. That is when L.K. Advani built his politics. His politics was built around the Mandir movement because the idea was to unite the Hindus. That is when V.P. Singh, Mulayam Singh Yadav, Lalu Yadav, Nitish, they started their own politics, which was built around the Mandal Commission report, which was to give reservation to other backward castes. So what happened? One side was trying to use religion, one side was trying to use caste to divide what religion united. The other side was trying to reunite with religion what caste divided. So you could see then that this is the politics of tomorrow. So that's when the expression Mandir versus Mandal, or Mandal versus Kamandal came in. Kamandal just to rhyme it, but basically it was Mandir versus Mandal. Kamandal is the thing that sadhus and all carry, that that wooden lota. So it became Mandal versus Kamandal. So since then, for 30 years, India's politics, especially the heartland politics, is the same. The binary is the same. Can you use caste to divide what religion united? Or can you use religion to reunite what caste divided? In fact, if you look at what's happening in America right now, politics has very similar streams everywhere. Every riot that happens on the streets of America, it doesn't embarrass Trump. Trump is happy. You see his tweets. Every morning he wakes up, he puts out one tweet in all capitals, law and order, with a sign of exclamation. That's all. Why? Because he knows that this is polarizing America on black and white lines. It suits him. Otherwise, he was going to lose anyway. This has given him a chance. So you could see that this is going to be the next big binary in Indian politics. Now, Narendra Modi, with the combination, he's gone religion plus. So he's using a combination of religion plus nationalism. That is a deadly glue. So he's able to hold the heartland together. That's why today the BJP knows that all they have to do is to win, is to sweep the Hindi heartland and two states of the West. That is Maharashtra and Gujarat, which in many ways think like the Hindi heartland states in terms of religion. So that is his formula. That's why he's not so bothered about southern states or this and that. I mean, he's bothered about West Bengal because he has to consolidate. Also, West Bengal is 33% Muslim, so the BJP wants to come and teach them, quote unquote, law and order. But beyond that, that is how this politics works. But once again, if you ask me, this is not going to remain like this, because nothing in politics remains frozen. I think this has been frozen for too long, and you will find that, and we have to now anticipate where will this change come from. So I am also struggling right now. I think on that note, I can stop and you people can ask me questions.
Thank you, sir, for this insightful talk. I have also read the book, Anticipating India, and some of the chapters find a part in your video of today. We'll start with the Q&A. We have the first question from Avnish Singh, who says, do you believe that the state governments do not face the same level of public scrutiny in the same way as the central government? Do language and lack of freedom of press at the state level play a role in this?
No, in fact, it's on the contrary. State governments face much greater scrutiny than the central government, because state governments are much closer to the voters, and most of what voters get delivered to themselves comes through the state governments. What happens, on the other hand, is in the Modi kind of environment, because he's such a domineering leader. So in BJP states which have BJP chief ministers, usually people focus on the prime minister, not on the chief minister. But some states are different. If you look at UP, for example, people of UP will look at the performance of their chief minister. Once again, if it's a national election, then they might look at national leaders, but that is logical. So state leaders are actually under much greater scrutiny. That's why Narendra Modi can sweep any election for himself, but he's not able to sweep elections for his state leaders. That's the reason BJP could not sweep. I mean, they got a lot of seats in Maharashtra, but they were not able to get a comfortable enough number in Maharashtra. They lost Jharkhand. They could not get a majority in Haryana. So you can see that the voter in the states is much more demanding, in fact.
Thank you, sir, for your answer. We next have a question from Ajit Chaudhary, who says that there have been contradicting articles in the print on Ambedkar and RSS links. So he's asking, why is the print creating such a confusion, and what is the principle behind having contradicting articles on certain connections?
Look, people like Ambedkar, Nehru, Gandhi, Patel, Bose, these were great people of a very important time. But it was also a time when my parents were young, right? And we were not I was not a thought in anybody's minds. So this is from some time back. These are also colorful characters with many sides to them. They are not boring characters. They're also very interesting characters. So different people will have different views on them, different interpretation of them. The problem in our country is that we either demonize a leader of the past or deify the same leader. No leader is either perfect or perfectly bad unless that leader was Hitler. So, and these were ideological leaders. These people had strong ideologies, strong policies, strong beliefs, strong personalities. They argued with each other. They were not clones of each other. So they are all multifaceted personalities, and different people see them differently. So those views should keep coming out. There cannot be an official history of Savarkar and only one history, official history of Bose, official history of Nehru. In fact, the problem in our country is that there is too little scrutiny of heroes of our past. That's why we can't make a proper biopic in India on any character from our history. We cannot write a proper biography on any character from our history because someone or the other will come and wanting to burn your office or throw black ink on your face for that. So that has to be challenged, and this debate has to widen.
Thank you, sir. We next have a question from Malyaban Sen, who is asking, what are your thoughts on the challenges that the political parties will face in the upcoming Bengal elections?
Well, I think Bengal elections are going to be very interesting because the binary in West Bengal. Binary is there is a large Muslim vote. Mamata Banerjee obviously thinks that if she can hold that vote and a sufficient number of Hindus vote for her, she'll be okay. The BJP knows it, so they want to consolidate the Hindus. That's why all these Bangladeshis are coming in. CA has to happen, etc., etc. Hindus are in danger. And then you have Bengal is complicated because the left and the Congress also have some votes. Although a lot of the lefts and Congress votes have shifted to the BJP, but still they have a lot of votes. So whatever votes come to them will be at Mamata's cost. So what happens in West Bengal will depend on that. BJP will throw a lot of money in West Bengal. BJP in any case outspends any other party about 50-1. So if BJP's opposition spends 100 rupees, BJP spends 5,000 rupees. It is that kind of difference. BJP is probably the richest political party in the world right now. They have so much money. You saw Amit Shah delivered his first election speech in Bihar yesterday. How many? There were 75,000 LED screens in Bihar. 72,000, something like that. Even Xi Jinping can't do things like this in China with all his power and all his resources. So BJP has a lot of resources. So they will come with all that at Mamata. But Mamata is not a pushover. She's a very tough leader. In fact, I don't know, can you see the wall behind me? I don't know if you can see the wall behind me right there. That painting is by Mamata Banerjee. So I'd gone to her house once and she climbed onto something and she said, I paint. And then she pulled a couple of paintings out and she gave them to me. So that one is actually, you see the corner, it says Mamata. This is part of the collected works Mamata Banerjee. So she's an interesting person, but she's a very tough leader. So she'll not be a pushover. I think you will see us in Bengal during the elections. It will be quite a fun election. In fact, if I come in for some time, I'll be happy to come to your college around that time.
Yes, sir. If you come to Bengal, we'll definitely host you. We next have a question from Aniket Singh, who says, on the issue of political journalism and the role of media in civil discourse, how could the rise of selective and biased media at the cost of factual independent journalism be countered? And could a journalist ever be free of his or her ideology?
See, nobody can be free. Anybody who's free of their ideology or views is a robot. It's not a human being, right? Because all of us vote ultimately. But then Chief Justice of India votes, President of India votes, Chief Election Commissioner also votes. So you vote, you have your ideology, you have your beliefs, but you also have your professionalism. It's like when you go to a doctor and doctor feels your liver and doctor thinks that you've been overdoing some good things in life like alcohol and your liver is enlarged. The doctor doesn't say that your liver is enlarged because it's a Muslim's liver or a Hindu's liver or whatever. So that is professionalism. So professionalism is there. It is not easy. And also these days, anything you do, you will run into one wall or the other because we are very polarized. So the important thing these days is to keep your composure and keep your sanity and not hand over your judgment to the mob of any kind. Because if you submit to the mob on one side, then word will go out that you can be unnerved. Then you will have to submit to the mob on the other side. You see what's happened in the New York Times yesterday. Their op-ed page editor has had to leave because he published an op-ed article by a senator of the Republican Party who said call out the troops to put down these protests. So there was a big protest by the woke elements in the New York Times newsroom. First the owners defended this. Now he's quit. Now that is, I mean, it's shocking that the owners and editors of the great New York Times have succumbed before a mob. Mobs have to be dealt with because once you do this, then there is no limit. So this is a tough time, but as readers, as viewers, all of you can also figure out who's coming from where. Audiences are very smart now, and I think that's the reason. Because you are smart, that's the reason you're reading the print.
Sir, we next have a question from Sumit Gupta, who is saying, do you think that the fund generated through the PM CARES can be susceptible to misuse by the government, given the fact that there is no scrutiny, as the PMO has clearly denied RTI for the fund?
Well, yes, it's disappointing and it's wrong. I don't think they'll get away with no transparency over this. At some point, they will have to submit this to some kind of serious Sarkari type audit. Because anything set up under a trust, this is done under a trust structure. All of you are studying law. You know that anything which is a trust structure in India has to go through audits. There is a commissioner or whatever you call, registrar or whatever you call it. All that has to happen. But I think this is too significant a project. The money is far too much for it to escape scrutiny. It's very important that in public debate, we keep on raising these demands and asking for more scrutiny. I think at the end of the day, there will be something. Otherwise, this can be misused. This can be misused not by way of, I don't think Mr. Narendra Modi will buy a private jet for himself. He doesn't need one. But it can be misused in the sense of selectively deciding who you will give this money to, which state, which project, etc., etc.
The next question is from Varun Kanan, who is asking, sir, what are your thoughts on the manner in which the central government has handled the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown? And is the center solely to be blamed for what the situation of the country is, or are state governments equally responsible?
Well, I think the center did well to declare the first lockdown. But the problem with Narendra Modi's style is, when it decides all right, but it decides in isolation of everybody else. It considers it beneath its dignity to consult anybody. So that lockdown was announced at a 4-hour notice. 8 o'clock, sham ko 8 baje. In fact, I saw a meme the other day that has a Sardarji saying, "Sir, aap 8 baje se 8:30 ke beech mein nahi bola karo, because I start drinking at 8, and by the time I finish speaking, sari utar jati hai." Right? So that is not a time to say that 4 ghante mein lockdown. You can give people time. He never spoke with any chief minister. That is wrong, because India is governed by its chief ministers. You have to take them into confidence. But I think in terms of just the governance style, he's over-obsessed with this shock and awe style to impress. And that's what led to trouble. And that's why this migrant crisis and the rest happened. Because you did not anticipate it. You have to game these things. Now, states, on the other hand, because once the states saw that the Prime Minister has announced this big lockdown all on his own, then the states saw no incentive in asking for an opening up, because the states thought, he is deciding on the lockdown, let him decide on the opening up, because if stuff hits the fan, why should we be held accountable? Let him be accountable. Also, again, you know the law under Epidemic Act and NDMA, National Disaster Management Act, the center took enormous powers over the states. So some states have done better. For example, a state which is rarely praised for what it's done. Everybody says Kerala model, Kerala model. I think Karnataka is doing brilliantly on this. Look at Bangalore. Bangalore's per million fatality rate is 1. Mumbai's per million fatality rate is some 84 or 85 now. Delhi's is about 48 now. So there are states and there are states. And I think ultimately what you get at the bottom line is the net outcome of what the states are doing.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Shreyas Sridhar, who is asking, how do you see political dogmas being set in when a leader knows that he is going to stay in power for a long time? In this context, what is the feasibility of having term limits like in the US, at least in the states, if not the center?
Well, with term limits, yes, but the time to talk about term limits is not when somebody who sees himself as a front runner in the next election, whatever, is in power. The time to think of limited terms is when you have coalition governments in power. Because then otherwise, if you do it now, it will be seen as, because nobody wants Modi to rule for 3 terms or 4 terms, Nehru rule for 3 terms, Indira rule for 3 terms. What is the problem? So these are issues, but then you see systems like, say, America, that's a direct election of the president. That is not the situation in India. Although American system has its merits. For example, if you look at, in fact, that's what I read in American politics these days because it's their election year, and also Trump is such an interesting character, that why do most presidents get re-elected in America? One, because it's only 2 terms, so people think it's zyada kitna nuksan karega, 4 saal hi aur aayega, 2 4-year terms. And second, because people have now internalized the idea that in the first term, our presidents are too concerned about winning their next election. But in the second term, they don't have that concern. So in the second terms, our presidents are a lot more decisive. And which is true if you go back at least to recent history, Clinton, Obama, the 2 Bushes, father and son, you will find some of that is true. But I think in India, to think of that kind of a big change right now is tough. And that to start talking of a change when somebody is on his second term. And today, ceteris paribus looks like he might have a 3rd term. Who can stop him? Not Rahul Gandhi. So in that situation, this debate is not relevant.
We next have a question from Dipanshu, who is asking that, sir, recently Arnab Goswami resigned from the Editors Guild, and also journalists from the opposite side of the spectrum have questioned the Editors Guild as far as taking a stand on these issues is concerned. So can you elaborate on how the guild functions when it comes to neutral?
First of all, usually when I speak in public, I don't speak for the guild. I speak in my individual capacity. But since you asked me how does the guild function, the guild is not an elected organization. The guild is not a union. The guild is like people getting together with the limited objective of protecting media freedoms. The guild is not a regulator. It is not a watchdog of the media or a regulator. The guild has no power to tell somebody in the media, ye karo, ye nahi karo. Because the guild itself consists of 300 editors of various persuasions and who all have their own editorial views on different things. And it's not the same view. So the guild makes a larger point on issues of media freedoms. So even when Arnab Goswami was attacked physically, allegedly by 2 Congress workers in Bombay, the guild issued a statement. So we got attacked then by the other side, saying that how can you defend someone like Arnab Goswami, to which we said we don't judge Arnab Goswami's or anybody's journalism at the guild. We just believe that all journalists should have the freedom, and violence against any journalist is a wrong thing. So that's how the guild functions. Now I know that in the past, nobody seemed to remember the guild very much. Now the guild is in news. It's my good fortune that I am heading the guild now, maybe another month or so, because my 2-year term will come to an end. But it's a balance that you have to strike, because we are all different people, and most of the members of the guild disagree with each other in our editorial views. So then to create a consensus is not easy.
Thank you, sir. We next have a question from Samarth Sharma. He says, since you talked about Bihar and its politics briefly, what is your anticipation regarding the upcoming elections in Bihar? There seems to be a growing satisfaction with the Nitish Kumar government due to multiple issues. At the same time, there is reluctance in choosing anyone from the Lalu dynasty. So could you share your views on this?
Well, I haven't traveled in Bihar lately, but I can tell you that if Tejashwi Yadav is his competition, then going for Nitish will not be bad. All we have to see is what Nitish's next moves will be. Does he want to remain with the BJP forever? Because it will probably be his last election in Bihar. He's not getting younger. What's his future? Does he want one more victory in Bihar and then to retire as a 4-time, 5-time Chief Minister of Bihar? Or does he have any other ambitions? So that will be the question to watch. But right now, again, ceteris paribus, he's in a very good place.
We have the next question from Ananya Kumar, who is saying that the New York Times article which you talked about, and how that op-ed was criticized. So do you believe that unbiased media houses are obligated to present both sides of the argument when one of those sides is a dog whistle for just provocating violence?
Well, you should publish nothing which is a dog whistle for provoking violence from any side. This article, as I've read, is not really that. It says call out the army. It's like if there are riots going on, say in West Bengal. Initially, on the CA agitation started, some trains were burned. It's somebody from BJP road saying, call out the army. The police is not able to handle it. I may disagree with the person, but I don't think it's a call for violence like that. Now, no opinion pages are obliged to carry both sides. But there are opinion pages and opinion pages. For example, in America, mainstream papers in America, if you see the Wall Street Journal news pages are quite free, open, factual. But Wall Street Journal opinion pages, those 2 pages, are ideological. That is the ideology of the right, especially the economics of the right. So there, not just their own editorials, but all contributors also must conform to that larger ideological framework. New York Times has had a more eclectic mix. And lately, they've become very eclectic, in fact, very diverse. If you see Jim Bennett, who resigned last night our time, he has tweeted saying that on these pages, we published a defense of, somebody wrote a defense of pedophilia. And when that happened, some of these senior people resigned in protest in the New York Times. But he says none of the woke crowd protested about the article on pedophilia. So New York Times op-ed page has been pushing at the boundaries. And there are things they've done which would have got me very angry, for example. They ran an article by Sirajuddin Haqqani just 2 months back. Who's Sirajuddin Haqqani? He's the head of the Taliban. He's responsible for killing so many people, 3 attacks on the Indian embassy, killing lakhs and lakhs of people. Brutal killer, as bad as ISIS. And now, it's quite clear that Taliban and Al-Qaeda and ISIS are all joined up. But they ran an article by Sirajuddin Haqqani. And I said, what the hell are they doing? I mean, then I thought, will I run an article from Dawood Ibrahim? I will not. Right? Will I run an article by the head of Hizbul Mujahideen? I will not. But the fact is that the New York Times ran that article. So they were pushing at the boundaries of how wide a debate could a set of opinion pages have. And I think they were overdoing it in some areas. But that's my view as just another editor.
Thank you, sir. Sir, how many more questions can we take?
Well, I think I have to record today's Katta Clutter, so 2 more questions.
All right. We next have a question from Anand Krishnan, who is asking, what is your opinion about the hijacking of identity politics by radical disruptive ideologies, which has been discussed by liberal activists from a long time? He's asking this in the context of how libertarians have been discussing police brutality since a long time, but the left has taken over the Black Lives Movement in the US.
Well, first of all, I'm not sufficiently educated on what is going on in the US. I think what we see is just an outburst of anger. It's a pent-up resentment for a long time. And, after 4 years of Trump, there's also a sense that we have been disempowered. Because see, if you go back to the 2 Bush's White Houses, they were quite careful to empower the blacks. Colin Powell, right? Senior Bush, Junior Bush. Condoleezza Rice, right? These were all blacks. And they had the top positions in those Republican governments. Then you had Obama, 8 years of Obama. But now you have Trump, whose White House and whose establishment is all fully white. So there is a feeling among the African Americans that they've now been disempowered. Similarly, if you look at India, if you look at Narendra Modi's cabinet, this cabinet has the smallest number of minority members ever in India's history, ever. This cabinet has only 1 Muslim. Can anybody name that Muslim?
Mukhtar Abbas Naqvi.
Yeah, and what's his portfolio?
Minority affairs.
Minority affairs. So there's only 1 Muslim and he's handling minority affairs. This cabinet does not have a Christian, right? India has never had a cabinet that did not have a Christian. The 2 or 3 tribals they have are non-Christians. So you can see Muslims, Christians, they must feel disenfranchised right now. Now it's not good enough to say कि ठीक है मैं तेरा ध्यान रखूंगा. This is a democracy. It's a republic. Everybody must have their share of the power. The former chief minister of Nagaland, Neiphiu Rio, is an ally of the BJP. He could have been. He contested elections in last parliament election. He got elected. Why is he not made a minister? At least you will have one naam ka vaste Christian. But this is a deliberate exclusion, and that is what Trump has done with African Americans. So when you deliberately exclude your minorities, they notice what's going on. And then you will find this resentment comes out in different ways.
We'll have the last question for today from Vishal Chaudhary, who is asking, why is it that economic reforms in India happen only during times of crisis, including those that should have been given effect to much earlier? And how do we change that?
Well, because nobody really wants to do economic reforms. I will say that in India's history, we've had only 1 prime minister who really understood the essence of economic reforms and wanted it, who was genuinely a believer in the idea that government should get out of business. Or what Nitin Gadkari now says, "Jis desh ka raja vyapari, uski janta bhikhari." Right? So, and that leader was Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Unfortunately, he was there for too short a time. Now, Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh brought about reform, but they were not instinctive reformers. They were all reformers come lately. They were all former socialists who now figured that वो चल नहीं रहा है जो पहले कर रहे थे. We have to try something else. I think in the course of time, Dr. Manmohan Singh, given how much intellect he had, did become an instinctive reformer. In fact, he would then say when he was prime minister that, look, all growth creates inequality. So when you have growth, you have to prepare for inequality. But just because growth will create inequality, you can't say I will not have growth, because growth will still benefit a lot of people. So, intellectually, India has had very few reformers, intellectually and philosophically. And if you look at this government, I'm afraid nobody in this government is an instinctive or philosophically reformer. They talk a lot, But then they say Swadeshi, etc., etc. That's not reform. Reform is exposing yourselves to competition.
Thank you, sir. It was I also thank the members of the audience for asking such good questions, and it was really enlightening. We'll continue to have more discussions. Probably in the near future, if you come to Bengal, you can also visit the university. It was great having you. I'll now like to call Aditi for delivering a small vote of thanks.
Before that, can I say something?
Yes, sir, sure.
So all of you, once you finish, if you haven't done so, and I will check, please subscribe to our YouTube page and to our social media handles. So you like our Facebook page, our Instagram page, and follow us on our Twitter page. And soon we are starting a very interesting product. We are starting a new product called Campus View, which is CV. So we'll call for opinion articles from our campuses every week. And there'll be prizes. So top 3 articles, first, second, third will be published. And each one will get a sizable bunch of gifts. So we have people like Fab India, Parker Pens, etc., etc., etc. And we are adding up lots of gifts. So this will start, I think, within a week from now. So please keep track of that. And go ahead, Aditi.
Hello, sir. Now, as the treasurer of IDG, I take this opportunity to thank you for joining us in these tough times and sharing with us your thoughts. We are truly privileged to have interacted with you and learned the nuances of the issue from your valuable experience. I hope each one of us is taking something from what has been a truly enlightening session. So, we are extremely honored that you graced us with your presence. I also thank Ms. Naya for coordinating with us all this while. I would also like to thank our committee members and all participants who joined us and for putting up such wonderful questions and helping us make this session successful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.